Okay, before we get started with today's seminar, we have a couple of pretty exciting announcements related to the SIG and to systematic review and meta-analysis happenings. The first is that last night, the ERA 2022 convention program dropped. I know you all were probably waiting up to get that link. And for this year's convention, our SIG had a record-breaking number of proposal submissions. And as a result of that, we have the biggest, most extensive and most robust program in the SIG's history. We've got 9 sessions over the course of the convention. And that includes some in-person sessions, some online sessions, and it includes a very healthy mix of applications of systematic review on a range of topics, as well as some research on systematic review methodology. So you can see the full program through the ERA portal. I would encourage you to take a look. Second, our SIG is in a position to offer a limited number of sponsored registrations for the convention. And we're going to focus those on graduate students who are members of the SIG. So if you are a graduate student, a member of the SIG, and you don't have funding to attend the convention, either virtually or in person, reach out to me and we can see about covering the cost of your conference registration. And also look for an announcement about that on the SIG listserv later today. And then finally, I will pass it over to Jay for some announcements about upcoming training opportunities.
Hey, hello everyone. Thanks again for joining the seminar series. So grateful for everyone being here. Just wanted to take a second to announce that the Meta-Analysis Training Institute and the Modern Meta-Analysis Research Institute are now accepting applications for our 2022 cohort. If you've been tapped in, you do know that Maddie, the Meta-Analysis Training Institute for last year was postponed due to COVID-19, but we have plans set to be able to host a training in person this year in Chicago, as well as our Modern Meta-Analysis Research Institute, MARI, which we'll be hosting in Atlanta. And so just a quick, if you're thinking about which training you may want to participate in, just know that MARI, the one that will be hosted in Atlanta, is more of an introductory workshop for getting started with R and meta-analyses if you have minimal to no experience in systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And then Maddie is more of a kind of want to get away from the word advanced, but we do spend a bit more time doing more programming in R and exploring some other approaches to doing meta-analysis research. So just whichever one you're interested in, I will drop the applications for both in the chat. And if you have any questions about which training might be appropriate for you, or just any questions in general about the trainings, you can reach out to me or Terry. I will also leave our emails in the chat as well. So thank you. Without further ado, I will turn it back to the SIG.
Okay, thanks, Jay. I think that's it for business. We'll turn to party time. For today's seminar, I'm really pleased to introduce our colleague, Dr. Erika Patall, who is Associate Professor in the Rossier School of Education at USC. Erika is an expert in the nature, determinants, and development of motivation, particularly in educational contexts. She's also a really accomplished and prolific research synthesist, having conducted now, I think, dozens of reviews on topics like the effectiveness of homework, choice-making opportunities and intrinsic motivation, the consequences of negative feedback, and a number of other topics. Finally, Erika is an influential voice on the methodology of research synthesis, and it's in this capacity that she'll be speaking today on the implications of open science for research synthesis in education. I think she's planning to present for maybe 30 minutes, maybe a bit longer, and then after which we should have plenty of time for discussion. You're also welcome to drop questions into the Zoom chat box at any point, and we'll try to curate those and bring them to her attention sort of as it seems appropriate. So with that, let me pass the Zoom window over to Dr. Erika Patall.
Thanks, James. Okay, let me just get my slides up and we'll get started here. Okay. All right. It's great to see all of you. I'm really excited to be here to be talking to you about open science and the implications of that for research synthesis. So let's just get started. So just a little agenda here. I'm going to just introduce you all to the topic, and then we'll start by just talking about what are some of the biases and questionable practices in primary research that open science has been a response to. We'll talk about the implications of those things for research synthesis, as well as the implications of the open science solutions in primary research for research syntheses. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the comparable biases and questionable practices in research syntheses and their, the comparable open science solutions for those. Okay, so I probably don't have to tell this group, research syntheses and meta-analyses are critical to the health of education research. Research syntheses and meta-analyses help researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and the public distill large, usually unwieldy scientific literatures. So let me give you a couple examples of why it's so important. So first, many researchers in education do research syntheses with the explicit intent to guide education policy and practice. So here's just some examples. Research I did with Carlton Fong, who's in the room right now. Our goal with one of the syntheses we did was to inform teachers on how negative feedback can be used without completely destroying students' motivation. When I was a grad student, I worked on a synthesis on the effectiveness of homework for achievement. And from that work, we came up with the 10-minute rule of limiting homework to just 10 minutes per grade level. And that became routinely adopted by schools and even national associations like the National PTA and the National Education Association. And as another example, syntheses on social emotional learning interventions and their effectiveness have clearly made a mark on education. A lot of districts and schools around the country have embraced cell programming, including New York City and Los Angeles, where I am, the two largest districts in the country. So here's the problem, right? Despite their utility and growing popularity, research syntheses are threatened by what I might call an existential crisis. The problem is that the results of research syntheses are potentially misleading, in part because the primary research that they synthesize might be misleading. So in recent years, and I'm not remotely the first person to say this, I'm like the millionth, evidence has started to accumulate that social and health science research has some questionable practices and biases that reduce the trustworthiness of science. Education practitioners and policymakers, they require high quality research syntheses to make good decisions, right, about things like, should programs be continued or discontinued? Should they endorse certain practices or discourage practices? The creation or revision of policy or the allocation of resources. And that kind of decision-making will be flawed if the research syntheses we produce are misleading. So the purpose of this talk today is going to be to discuss the implications of some of the questionable research practices and the open science strategies that are intended to address them for the way we do research syntheses and meta-analyses and the quality of the information they produce. Before I do anything else, first, I want to have a little disclaimer, and that is that I am not really an expert regarding open science, nor have I been a really good model of open science practices. If you were to look at my research, you would find tons of studies that are, full of data contingent analyses or meta-analyses I haven't pre-registered. Even today, I've still got plenty of work that did not start with the intent to be good at open science. So I don't have all the solutions, and I consider myself a learner in this space as well, just trying to figure out the best way forward. Okay. So let's start with some of the issues. Here's the problem. Illusory results and beliefs about the state of education science may exist as a result of three broad things: publication and dissemination biases, a variety of questionable practices that researchers use that could be unified under the rubric of selective reporting biases, and limited self-correction in science through replication. So let's start with the first two on that list, publication bias and replication issues. This is not news to this group. Research has repeatedly demonstrated that non-significant findings are often left unpublished, and editors and external reviewers have a bias favoring large or significant research findings. Authors themselves tend to focus on only publishing significant results, with upwards of 2/3 of research going unpublished. You guys probably all remember the classic study from Greenwald from 1975 that showed that about 41% of authors only submit a study for publication if it had statistically significant results. So has this really, we know about this, has this really improved? Probably not really. So a few examples from Kittleman: 4% of intervention studies in high impact education journals are actually replications. Under 1% of articles in top impact education journals are 4% have null effects. Less than 1% are replications. And it seems this problem has actually increased over time by about 22% since 1990. What about those questionable research practices? So evidence has also started to mount suggesting that researchers engage in a variety of questionable practices that have implications for the trustworthiness of research findings. I'm not talking about explicit misconduct or falsification of data. That is pretty rare. I'm talking about things that are actually defensible in many contexts, but can also be used to exploit opportunities for detecting evidence that might produce something exciting or something significant that makes it more likely to be published. So the kinds of practices that I'm referring to are things like examining many comparisons without adjustment, or excluding data points, or including covariates based on post hoc criteria, or excluding conditions in an experiment, or entire studies based on the results, are deciding when to stop or start data collection based on the results, reporting only select outcomes based on the results. So they're relatively common. I'm showing you self-admission rates from psychologists from a classic study from John and his colleagues from 2012. But there's some education that it's not that different in education. So from our very own Terry Piggott, a study from 2013, she reported that about 45% of the 79 dissertations she could match with the journal article had some form of data censoring, outcome censoring based on statistical significance. Is this a problem? Well, probably the most persuasive evidence that it's a problem comes from like the huge replication studies that have been conducted by psychologists. So it was published in 2015 as a collaboration with the Open Science Collaboration. They reran about 100 studies that had been published in top journals in psychology. And what at using really well-powered designs that use all the same original materials and multiple measures. And the outcome of that was about 36% of the replications showed statistically significant effects compared to the 97% of the original studies that had shown statistically significant effects. So this is a good point to pause and just note that these questionable research practices are problematic, but they're also defensible under certain circumstances. They may be important for precision or efficiency or discovery. So, and that's probably maybe even especially true in education. So I would argue that the real problem that is created is when, in an effort to present a coherent message, researchers don't present their research narratives as they really happened, which was in an exploratory and data contingent fashion with a lot of decision points. Okay, so what are the consequences? The consequences is that the end result is that research consumers probably can't tell the difference between meaningful findings and trivial or non-existent findings, either because some of the research is missing entirely, or because we can't tell how researchers' decisions have influenced what's been found. And I put a star on meaningful because I just want to be clear that I still think there's plenty of meaningful findings in education. I'm not of the mind that most of our findings are false positives, just more than we want. Okay. What are other consequences? Well, most researchers don't actually want to be deceptive. So the state of affairs can be discouraging high-risk research that could yield null findings if done correctly, essentially. Researchers and funders may waste resources attempting to extend evidence on phenomena that they already might have known had modest effects or it's just completely false. If the evidence were made available, funding can be wasted. And the worst case scenarios is that policies are created that are ineffective or even harmful. That's the really worst case scenario. And all that can lead to the erosion of public trust. We're kind of seeing that right now with COVID, right? Like what happens when you're inconsistent with your message? Craziness. I'll just summarize it that way. But what happens when we're inconsistent with our education research? Well, opinion seems just as good as research. And we already know that education policymakers and educators themselves are pretty distrustful of research. For decades now, they have sort of at a high rate than other professions said that they think research is neither trustworthy nor usable. So it's a problem. Okay. What does this mean for research synthesis? Well, the dissemination and reporting biases mean an illusion of evidence in primary research will be transferred to illusions of evidence in research syntheses. But I would say the problem may be even more problematic because with research syntheses, the evidence now appears particularly robust and even more likely to guide theory and future research and policy and practice, having the weight of findings from many studies behind it. Okay, so this is not to say that we're unaware of these issues and have no strategies for addressing them. That's not at all true. Research synthesis have their own best practice guidelines intended to guide researchers in the process of making transparent, trustworthy, and reproducible research syntheses. I bet many of you look at the MARS or the PRISMA guidelines or guidelines from Campbell Collaboration. And those recommendations are meant to mitigate the impact of biases in primary research, as well as the biases that emerge in the process of synthesizing research itself. Most salient, I would say, research synthesis are keenly aware of dissemination biases in primary research and have developed lots of strategies in response, right? We engage high quality syntheses engaged in an exhaustive, time consuming, extremely painful search process to locate unpublished research. I'm sure I have a long list that usually takes 2 years to get through, and I bet many of you do too. But the thing is, it's actually not universal that we do these things and use all these searches. When researchers have assessed about how many syntheses actually engage in that kind of thing, in extensive searching for unpublished work, only 63% of published syntheses attempt to find unpublished research to minimize publication bias, at least in psychology journals. Problem is, we know that it makes a difference. Our own Josh Polanin, who's not here, why isn't he here listening to my talk? I mean, what's wrong with that guy? I'm kidding, of course, I love him. But it wasn't that long ago, 2016, that he demonstrated by examining meta-analyses that had been published in PsychBull and Review of Ed Research between '86 and 2013. Any that had reported the difference between published and unpublished research, he got an average effect of that difference, and it was about 0.8. So it does make a difference whether or not we're doing these things. Other things we try to do to minimize bias, we try to collect standardized forms of information for every study. We collect fairly basic statistics to make sure that we can compute comparable effect sizes for every study. Why is that meaningful? Well, it means that research syntheses are a little less susceptible to the complex decision-making that happens at the analysis stage in primary research. What's the problem though? We often can't actually, there's a lot of missing information that we often can't get when we're using those basic statistics to compute our effect size. And then sort of some dream things, we'd like to be able to detect questionable research practices, but we often can't tell when primary researchers maybe have selectively excluded data or conditions or outcomes. And we'd also like to seek all the missing information we could, to compute effect sizes or to do moderator analyses. And we may try to engage in a fairly painstaking task of contacting authors to get that missing information, or maybe we do some missing data techniques. I think Terry did a talk on that for this group not that long ago. For me, it's not that clear how much effort research synthesis are putting into finding that missing information and contacting our authors. I just don't know. I bet it's about the same rate as how many people try to find unpublished research. But in my experience, it's a fairly unproductive experience with very few people responding with the information you need to fill in missing information. What's my point? My point is that even the best syntheses that are trying to combat these biases in primary research are probably missing critical information that leads to inflated pooled effect size estimates and conclusions that phenomena are more important than they really are. And while we could try to use moderator analyses to uncover whether studies vary depending on characteristics indicative of questionable practices, a lack of consistent and transparent reporting really limits that opportunity. Just to give you a sense of like what the impact can be. So this was a study from Kavarin and colleagues that try to assess like, what is the difference? Like how much might be meta-analyses missing the mark? So what they did is compared 15 meta-analyses to 15 large-scale pre-registered replications in psychology. And they found that 12 out of 15 had pretty substantially different average effects from the pre-registered huge replication studies. They were with the effects being like 3 times as large in the meta-analyses. Now, this is probably a particularly dramatic example. This was research that people were suspicious enough of to conduct these replications for, but suggests we might have a problem. Okay, so what are the solutions? Pre-registration, transparent reporting, open access to data, materials, and statistical code, so data sharing, and registered reports. These are all broad strategies that have been suggested that probably will have the greatest impact on primary research and research syntheses. So let's go through those. And let me pause for 1 second to ask James, do I have any questions? No. Oh boy. I hope it's
Step it up, folks. Come on.
Maybe I'm just really clear. I'm going to go with that assumption.
We're just enthralled, Erika.
Yeah. All right. Good. All right. So pre-registration. First, what is it? It's when researchers plan and document their questions, hypotheses, procedures, materials, and analyses prior to data collection, or at least prior to data analysis. What are the benefits? First, my favorite benefit. It helps minimize publication bias by creating an unbiased sampling frame for meta-analyses. So it creates a systematic tool to identify all the relevant tests of hypotheses, whether or not a report exists, whether or not the report is published, and even regardless of how good it might be. Okay, so if all research was pre-registered, and assuming we could search registries efficiently, we wouldn't really need to do all those, all the different kinds of searching that we currently do. We could just look at registries for research that meet our inclusion criteria. Registries that contained all or just something closer to all attempted research would also reduce our problem that we sometimes have when we start a research synthesis and then we realize there's no research to include in that synthesis or not enough research. But even if the registries were not comprehensive, but more people pre-registered their research, it would still have benefits. Registries would still represent an unbiased sampling of research because it would have been created before the results were known. Other advantages are it reduces selective reporting by encouraging more transparent reporting in line with the plan. We know that researchers are motivated to be more thoughtful about their analytic approach and transparent in the reporting as to how well aligned their research procedures and analyses they have chosen to focus on in line with their initial plans. Just as an example, the number of non-significant findings is, significant findings is reduced when studies are pre-registered. And since coding guides can be created based on the pre-registration, the chances of unknowingly missing outcomes or unknowingly including effects that are based on selective samples or just for example, that would be reduced because pre-registrations would provide meta-analysts with critical clues regarding those kinds of things. And then since a key aspect of a research study would be documented prior to data collection and data analysis, and changes would be marked as such, research synthesis could more readily evaluate the impact of post hoc decisions that might be influencing results. Of course, there's tons of challenges too. I don't want to act like this is just like, yeah, we're just going to do this. There's no problem. No, wrong. There's plenty of challenges too. First, the purpose of pre-registration can't be to just lock researchers into a particular approach without flexibility for conducting exploratory or hypothesis generating analyses. A lot of valuable insights come from an iterative approach to data analysis that's not easily pre-registered. And I would say this is especially true in education research, where we value high ecological validity. We do field studies and work with teachers and schools, right? And if you're a good education researcher, you know there's going to be challenges as you do that field work, and you better salvage your study by any means necessary, right? And sometimes those changes can't be anticipated. So pre-registration cannot be used to devalue that kind of high ecologically valid research. It's also possible that it doesn't actually reduce all the questionable practices. People might, for example, put in a lot of pre-registrations to hedge their bets for the same study. And the most, for me, maybe the most important one as a research synthesis is that there's a logistical concern. That is, without a centralized system, right now we have a lot of different registries, though some are more popular than others, like OSF and RACE. But there's still a lot, and without a centralized one, it's still going to be hard to completely locate all studies that might be relevant to your synthesis. So for now, my pro tip for you all is I recommend that research synthesis try to make sure that they're including popular registries among their search strategies, request reports for studies that are pre-registered that you don't otherwise find a report for, treat pre-registration that document as part of the report to code, and potentially use pre-registration status and any changes to the pre-registration as a moderator. Okay. What about other things? Open access. So lots of studies will not be published, and research synthesis require that pre-registration is accompanied by access to reports and ideally sometimes raw data, research materials, protocols, so that research findings can be comprehensively and comparably included in research syntheses. Plus sharing.
Erika, sorry to interrupt you. There may have been a question about the pre-registration process.
Yeah.
If you want to take a minute for that. Emily, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're talking about flexibility with this process of pre-registration. I'm wondering how much, because I recently finished my first meta-analysis, but there's a learning curve with that. And so like as a meta-analysis newbie, I was really like fearful to pre-register because I was like, I don't really even know what an effect size is all the time and like which one is the best for me. And I don't even know what the literature looks like for my research question yet and what potential moderators might pop up. So I don't want to tell someone I'm going to collect these and then maybe it actually look like it's more biased when I have 7 million changes on my pre-registration. Like, can you speak to that? Or like, do you have any advice about that process?
Yeah, I mean, I have the same exact experience as you when I'm pre-registering. Like I'm very, like we have a billion people look at our pre-registrations before we do them. Like everybody on the team has to sign off. Plus like we'll ask, friends like, how does this look, So I understand exactly where you're coming from. My advice would just be, accept that there is a learning curve and just do it, to be honest, and be honest with your changes. And also just give yourself plenty of time to review before you actually submit the pre-registration. So I'll get to this. Right now, I've been talking about pre-registrations for primary studies, helping research syntheses, but I'm also going to recommend pre-registering our meta-analyses. I would just, what do I think is the appropriate timing? I think you got to give plenty of time to actually decide, like become familiar with the research before you actually pre-register. Don't jump the gun on pre-registering before you've given some time to figure out like what are the best moderator questions that I'm going to a priori address, and what are all the search strategies that I really need. And then you'll limit the likelihood of making a lot of changes, though I think you're going to make changes. And one of my points is that should be okay as long as we report them. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, good. Should I keep going, James? Okay, so my other point of benefit with open access is that I mean, how many of you on that topic of moderators, how many of you have started with like a long list of moderators and then you realize you can't examine like most of them because there's so much missing information? So open access would kind of solve that problem because it makes information more available to facilitate those interesting moderator analyses. Of course, there's challenges too, right? The process of going through pre-registration protocols, open access, study materials, as well as research reports in order to extract relevant information is not exactly going to be easy, fast, or straightforward. So it's going to fall on us to, make, strong coding guides and protocols for data extraction where we really rigorously train our coders on how to do all that. But I still think there's benefits. So pro tip for now, be looking for open access links, and to limit, for the efficiency issue, stick to your coding guide and your planned coding protocol as you examine all that information. A final suggestion, registered reports. So what is that? It's when research is accepted for publication via a peer review process based on the study protocol and not the results at all. And once the research is conducted, publication is only contingent on having followed the plan that you set out for in the first place and identifying and justifying any exploratory analyses that were done after submitting the protocol. What are the benefits? So again, this approach combats dissemination and dissemination bias and questionable practices because it ensures that publication is based on the study design rather than the findings. And if it were implemented widely, just like pre-registration, it would also provide an unbiased sampling frame for of studies for research syntheses that would help combat publication bias. What's the challenge? Well, registered reports may have the potential to create bias against high-risk research if reviewers systematically reject proposals with hypotheses that run counter to reviewer expectations. But for now, my pro tip for you all is, registered reports aren't that common, but I would suggest we should be coding for both pre-registration and registered report status and be using that as a moderator in our analyses to see how that changes what we're finding in our research syntheses. Okay, so what about research syntheses themselves? I might have so much trouble saying the word synthesis over and over again. Is this a problem for everybody? It's the worst. Okay, I'm glad I'm at least not alone. Okay, what are the parallel issues? We have our own challenges and we need comparable solutions. So I just want to go through those a bit. Transparency and replication. Given all our complaining about primary researchers, not reporting everything that we need for our meta-analyses, you would think we might have a high degree of transparency in our research syntheses. That's unfortunately not true. Research syntheses often fail to describe in sufficient detail inclusion criteria, search strategies, coding procedures. We don't always give all the information about the primary studies that are in the synthesis, and results can often be missing regarding the primary studies from meta-analyses. Polanin and colleagues sort of try to quantify this by doing a meta review of 150 studies from PsycBull and found that about 55% of the PRISMA criteria were actually reported in published research syntheses. So one solution is for us to just start improving our transparency of research syntheses by following our own guides like Mars and Prisma to ensure that we're providing essential information and allowing others to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of our research syntheses. Like primary researchers, synthesis should also adopt the practices of openly sharing data study materials and statistical code. That combination of transparent reporting and open sharing of data, materials, statistical code, all that allows research syntheses to be more easily replicated, allows independent researchers to check and confirm our findings and find our inevitable errors, which should be welcomed, though I know we don't quite welcome that. And it helps identify reasons why research syntheses on the same topic often come to different conclusions, which is not at all uncommon. Another issue we have to deal with, by the time we publish these syntheses, they're often out of date. So how can we deal with that? Well, transparent reporting and open access allows researchers to more easily build off the work of existing meta-analyses. And open data and materials facilitates the practice of conducting continuously accumulating meta-analyses, making it easier to update existing syntheses as new research or new methods becomes available. Challenge, of course, there's always something. Many research synthesis are probably reluctant to share the data. It's a really hard process to do it, and we don't want to just give our work away. I would argue that even if it's for the good of science, I would argue that original synthesis are still in the best position to update their original reviews. So maybe we are worrying not about much. Even so, we probably as a community, a scientific community, need to talk about how to implement structures that would make sure that original research synthesis can be involved in all independent checks and updates in their work if they want to be. Another issue, while we high quality syntheses, we plan a protocol that we created in advance of starting our research process. As we become more familiar with the research, sometimes that influences our plans or definitions or searches we use or analyses we conduct. And it's possibly in a biased fashion. Now, I want to say I wholly believe that iteration is part of the process and part of a good research synthesis. There's lots of good reasons why we might be updating our protocol. So that's going to happen, but we need to be transparent about reporting how things changed or how our search strategies or inclusion criteria changed over time, which means pre-registration is probably a good idea for research syntheses as well. And with adjustments, you can use the already existing registries for that, like OSF and REIS, kind of. That one's more just for experiments. It's harder to use REIS, in my opinion. But OSF works okay. So pre-registration and registered reports ensure that there's a plan guiding the search and study inclusion decision-making prior to gaining knowledge of the findings. Challenge, of course, same thing I said to Emily. We can't be expected not to change. That can't be used as criteria for evaluating the quality of syntheses. It's part of the process and has to be part of the process. And last sort of issue that we can address is publication bias in syntheses themselves. Sometimes our syntheses are boring. They are a bunch of null findings that people perceive as like, you didn't even tell me anything I didn't already know. And they get suppressed sometimes or denigrated, especially when you say something that goes against the other researchers' expectations about what a synthesis should have found. I have experience with that personally. I won't even talk about it because I'm running out of time. But registered reports can help prevent reviewers from unfairly or often unintentionally suppressing research syntheses that violate their expectations. A challenge with that, one concern is that research syntheses may be discouraged for registered reports to the extent that reviewers may perceive their outcomes as easily predicted, given that the research already exists and is known to the synthesis. So we probably have to do some education of editors and reviewers along those lines for registered reports. All right. Oh, 5 minutes. And then I'm going to wrap up. okay, completely. So a prospective solution is prospective research synthesis. So it's not uncommon for syntheses on various education topics to conclude that there wasn't enough similar research to address an initial research synthesis question. And meta-analyses are also, just like primary research, they have a problem with small sample positive bias as well. Smaller meta-analyses tend to have bigger effects, okay? So one solution to that, both those challenges, is for meta-analysis to move from being a retrospective kind of a thing to a more prospective approach. That is, researchers can design studies with the intent to contribute to a research synthesis, and research syntheses can be designed before the primary research is ever conducted. Okay, and this is what's known as a prospective research synthesis or a prospective meta-analysis. So what does it mean? Like, let me try to give you an example. Let's say I want to do a research synthesis and meta-analysis on the effect of interventions training teachers to be autonomy supportive for students' motivation. A real stretch of the imagination for the kind of work I do, for those of you who know me. Okay, what would I do? I would plan the whole protocol for my meta-analysis. I'd lay out all my research questions. I would estimate how many studies I need to address those questions with sufficient power. I would conceptually and operationally define all the variables. I would make hypotheses. I'd make inclusion, exclusion criteria in an analysis plan. I'd make a timeline. And then I would pre-register that plan and make it public and solicit other researchers to actually conduct the primary research that would contribute to that meta-analysis. And I would collaborate with them to ensure that all the studies they're going to conduct are going to meet the inclusion criteria before they even do it, okay? And maybe we submit a registered report to make sure our work's going to get published before we do it. And the primary studies too would pre-register. We might make sure they're going to meet all meet inclusion criteria, but we might intentionally vary some things across the studies. We might even randomly assign studies to characteristics, right? So that we can answer questions that we want to answer in the synthesis. And once all the studies are completed, the research synthesis would definitely be able to answer the questions it was intended to answer and wouldn't suffer from all the problems that retrospective or traditional syntheses often suffer from. So it solves a lot of problems. This is my list. I'm not gonna go through it really. I'll just let you look at it because I want to wrap up. It's a good reason, right? To not say something you planned. They want to be done. Okay, so the thing is, prospective research syntheses are not that common. Probably because they require a lot of organization and coordination among researchers that our system does not currently support, with rewards for everybody for doing that. But so I would say, hello, funders, research universities, professional societies, journal editors, open science proponents. Can we get it together here and do things that are actually going to encourage people to do more prospective research syntheses? All right, I'm done. I hope I helped you understand how our current norms are a challenge for the validity of primary research and research syntheses, and how open science solutions can help, especially in education where we're applied and we want to guide policy and practice. And then I just want to make sure you also are aware of the challenges. We don't want to ignore those. If we're serious about doing this, it's probably going to slow down our productivity, and we probably need the broader culture to change a little bit if we're going to implement all these open science practices for real. But I think it would be worthwhile. So that's my last thought. Are there any questions?
Hey, thank you so much, Erika. And we do have a good amount of time for questions. So we open the floor. You're welcome to type questions into the chat or just raise your hand. We see a question from Esther.
Esther, go ahead, just tell me.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My internet is weird, so I might just disappear at any given point. But I wanted to, I'm working on a number of systematic reviews right now, and I'm trying to adhere to the PRISMA guidelines and be a diligent researcher. And I feel like I'm having to keep putting in workarounds, like the abstract requirements are super long. So James had advised that I put a link to posting a compliant abstract in like my OSF materials. I feel like I'm doing a lot of workarounds, and you kind of got at this at the end as far as like these open science, these strong practices sometimes require a little bit of jerry-rigging and a little creativity, and they slow us down to some degree, which seems to be expected. I was wondering, when I was going through the PRISMA guidelines in particular, which I know you didn't address specifically here, so you can say, you know, whatever. But I'm wondering if there's value in looking at some of these practices as a continuum in terms of the efforts that we can make to improve our systematic reviews and meta-analyses, rather than a yes, no, did you adhere to all of these things? So in particular, thinking about like how bias is evaluated in systematic reviews versus meta-analyses, how we do these things, where more guidance can come so that we can try to push ourselves in a certain direction, but not be scared off by, I didn't meet all of these criteria in trying to do that. Yeah.
So, I mean, okay. I started out this talk by telling you I was an imposter, and I really mean it. So I guess what my response would be is like, something is better than nothing, right? It should be a continuum. You do the best you can to, to do as many of these open science practices as you can, but right now we haven't mastered how to do them. It's not exactly easy or transparent to implement everything. So I would tell you, like, I hear a lot of like, you're trying really hard, and that is probably good enough right now. I don't know if that's a helpful response, but that's that's what I think about it. And your workarounds are the best.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
I would add to that. So it's a very common situation to, I've never seen pushback. Like if you're trying to follow Prisma, but like some of the items are just not relevant to what you're doing, and that's not uncommon, right? Like Prisma is really, it came out of medical health sciences, and so that's their focus, right? Like some of the like risk of bias assessment stuff, it's just not always relevant to education research, special education research, even less so probably, because like we don't do blinding of outcome assessments, for example. And so if you have even just a brief justification for why something is not relevant, I think you're fine. And like, sure, these guidelines are out there, but you also need to just use your judgment. Like you're the expert on your context. I think people are going to quickly defer to you if you have a good rationale.
Agree 100%.
Okay, I appreciate that. I was putting in not applicable, and then I was like feeling like a slacker that I wasn't doing my due diligence. So it's nice to get a little external validation on that. Thanks for your time.
Other questions?
Terry, did you get more questions than me?
Do I have any?
No. For your talk, did you get more questions? Am I doing a bad job?
No, you're not doing a bad job.
Erika, are you familiar with the Psych Science Accelerator at all?
Oh, I'm familiar with that label, and now I don't remember what it refers to.
Well, okay, so it's a group they're trying to do things that sound pretty similar to this idea of perspective synthesis, where they're meant to be like a distributed global laboratory for psychological research. So they have like a coordinating board that comes up with like the proposals for specific studies that they then field. They put out calls for people to participate in the studies. So, and they field contributors from all over the world. So the proposals are often registered reports, and they often essentially involve, saying we're going to conduct all of these primary studies and then do a synthesis at the end. So they're in the pretty early stages, but I think this is along the lines of what you're talking about.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
So maybe we need this in education.
I was also thinking about, and I don't know a lot about this in Cochrane, but they're doing these living systematic reviews, like continuously updating. And then one thing I'm starting to, this is not getting quite at, your vision, but for example, I'm working with some people to try to estimate the number of people who overdose, who inject drugs, because that's not an estimate that is around. And so trying to also do this kind of living systematic review where we gather up current data as it comes in to, update the meta-analysis. So I think there's a little bit of places where we can begin to implement parts of that vision.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, overall, I have the sense, and maybe it's not accurate, but that education in general is pretty behind the curve on all of this that I'm talking about today. So we have a little catch up to do, which is why I can give this talk and not somebody who knows more.
Erika, can I ask you about, so your point about needing to work on incentives for sharing the data from systematic reviews into syntheses. I feel like, so I'm involved in Psych Bulletin, and I feel like we've actually been making a lot of progress on this over the past maybe year and a half or so. Like almost all of the submissions that we see now include links to open data. And it's just because the editor-in-chief has made it a priority. And we're able to start getting more stringent about it.
How recent is that? Because I also review a lot for Psych Bull, but only education, only ed psych typically I get. And with ed psych, they seem like they are more like education, and that they're not sharing.
Oh, really? Okay. I don't see everything, but at least I think we're like the editorial policies are getting stronger.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering can you say more about what you see as like what should happen, what shouldn't?
Right. I mean, I think that's a start. The editorial policy is certainly shaped what people do in their research, because they want things to get published. But I'm worried a little bit that like the broader system doesn't support what editors are envisioning, right? So this all takes a lot more time, I think, or at least right now, because we're new to it. And there's still in universities a lot of, pressure to publish a lot. And so I would like to see also this being emphasized more. Now, it might be different in psych departments. Maybe they are having these conversations and adjusting their expectations and norms to accommodate more open science practices, but it's not a conversation in the education schools and departments in terms of guiding, like what are the expectations for faculty for doing quality research versus quantity of research. So I would like to see that side of things also change, and from funders as well. There's a lot of emphasis on speed, I think, and less emphasis like speed, assuming you can still maintain high quality, and that's not true.
Right.
This
Yeah.
is how we find ourselves in this.
I mean, I guess like my personal experience at least. So, moving towards a more open practice with synthesis projects, it was hard for me the first like 1 or 2 projects. But then you sort of like, you get the hang of it and you realize like, okay, well, what are the things that you need really like should have been doing up front in order to be prepared to, be in a position to just say, post all of your data or post your code along with, along with the manuscript. So like once you've been through it, I don't know, like, I don't think it actually slows things down substantially. It's just you have to shift your practices a bit. But I mean, it's just my personal experience.
You must be a low anxiety kind of person.
I mean, yeah, I have, all of the confidence of a mediocre white man. So.
I'll obsess on like, and it sounded like maybe some of you do that too, who are trying to pre-register. So it does slow me down, just like the weight of making everything public, and knowing that it could change, even though I'm advocating for that.
Right.
I'd like to also push the funders, because data management plans need to be, for syntheses they need to push a little bit on that too. So
yeah, I think so editors at high status journals and funders are a major leverage point for this sort of thing. And like the European funders are getting much more exacting about what they
Yes.
expect. Yeah.
Heard that.
Last call for questions. Okay, we'll leave it there. Let's thank Dr. Erika Patall one more time for joining us for this seminar. Our next seminar will be on, February 18th with Dr. Ryan Williams from the American Institutes for Research. His title is Model Building with Complex Meta-Regression, Strategies and Considerations. So it's going to get pretty geeky and pretty cool.
that's how we get him here, I guess. That's how we get him here.
Right. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see you all.
Thanks, Erika.